Alright, so picture this. There's a sealed envelope sitting in Prince Philip's private vault, right? And when it finally makes its way to King Charles, nobody's expecting what's actually inside. This isn't some sentimental keepsake or just another piece of royal paperwork. We're talking about Philip's final will, and the way it's written, it sends shock waves through Buckingham Palace. People who were there say Charles went pale, completely silent, just staring at the pages like the walls were closing in on him. So what secret did the Duke of Edinburgh keep locked away until his last breath? And here's the wild part. Why is Prince Edward, the guy everyone always saw as quiet and kind of in the background, suddenly at the center of everything? Now, let me set the scene for you. Charles gets this summons, no big announcement, no entourage, nothing. He's taken to this private chamber, the kind of room where history just happens quietly. On the table sits one thick envelope with Philip's vault insignia pressed into the seal. This isn't ceremonial. This is something Philip deliberately kept from the world, something even the crown had to wait to see. Everyone gets dismissed, the doors close, and for several minutes, dead silence. Then suddenly, there's this sound, like something getting knocked off a desk. Not anger, but pure disbelief. Later on, people working at the palace start whispering. They say Charles didn't call out for help or summon anyone. He just stood there, hands shaking, face completely drained of that practiced royal composure he's known for. In that moment, he wasn't reading a father's letter. He was facing a verdict. Here's where it gets really intense. Philip's will doesn't mess around with sentimental stuff or polite acknowledgments. It drops a declaration. Everything goes to Prince Edward. The personal estate, the symbolic legacy, private royal holdings that never even went through official channels. Nothing divided, nothing shared, clean transfer, everything. And we're talking about Edward, the one people overlooked, the quiet brother nobody expected to see written into history with this kind of authority. The guy everyone called boring? He's suddenly placed dead center of a decision that's about to reshape everything. The silence that follows is heavy. What comes next isn't anger from Charles, it's shock so deep he can barely process it. Within hours, they order a complete communications lockdown for 24 hours. Advisors get cut off. Private secretaries are told to stall every single inquiry. Even senior palace figures are left waiting with zero explanation. Something shifted, and this ancient institution that runs on image and control goes into defensive mode instantly. But here's the thing about walls. They've never really stopped rumors, have they? Speculation arrives fast and sharp. Did Philip leave more than just instructions? Did he deliver one final unmistakable message to his eldest son? Was this aimed not just at Charles the man, but at Charles the monarch? Or was it something even more calculated, more dangerous? Behind those closed doors, the whispers multiply. People start talking about amendments made quietly after Charles took the throne. Subtle changes, new clauses, a will that wasn't sealed in stone but kept evolving, responding, maybe even reacting. If that's true, it means Philip was watching, measuring, judging right up until the end. And if Edward's name stands alone where people expected to see the crown reflected, this wasn't sentiment, this was strategy. Because inheritances don't rattle kings, meanings do. What Philip left behind wasn't just property or prestige. It was a signal, carefully placed, impossible to ignore, powerful enough to make the entire palace wonder what it really meant to say. This was a challenge to the emotional order of the House of Windsor, a crack running through decades of rivalry, silence, and wounds nobody talked about. The envelope got opened, the words got read, and nothing inside those palace walls would ever settle the same way again. Now let's talk about Edward for a second. For years, people labeled him the Forgotten Windsor. Polite, not particularly ambitious, always a step behind his siblings, never close to real power. But Philip's will? It paints a completely different picture. Edward wasn't sidelined, he was chosen. So what is this really? A father quietly preparing a silent heir? Or a calculated attempt to steer the monarchy onto a totally different path throughout royal history? Edward was always there, but rarely front and center. He smiled for cameras, did his duties with quiet steadiness, never seemed to attract the chaos that followed everyone else. To the public, that restraint looked like disinterest, maybe even insignificance. But underneath, something more deliberate was forming. Philip, famous for his discipline and strategic thinking, seemed to see something in his youngest son that others completely missed. While headlines exploded with scandal and fractured loyalties, Philip was quietly building a different kind of legacy, one based not on applause, but on endurance. And this didn't start yesterday. This started years ago. Away from the cameras and front pages came private visits, unannounced meetings, subtle transfers of responsibilities. By the early 2000s, Philip had started moving select patronages around, consolidating private interests, placing his most closely guarded archives into Edward's hands. Not Charles, not Anne, Edward. The same Edward who stepped away from the Marines, who chose the steadier, quieter path, who never chased crowns or conflict. Over time, that choice started looking less like retreat and more like preparation. An apprenticeship conducted in silence under a father who valued discretion over display. Philip understood something crucial. True legacy isn't forged in noise, it's built in silence, and Edward listened, always. People close to Philip remember him repeating one phrase like a private mantra over the years. Edward is the only one who listens. To outsiders, Edward's loyalty might have looked passive, even forgettable. Inside the inner circle, it read completely differently. It was a rare kind of strength. While others questioned, pushed back, or maneuvered for position, Edward offered steadiness, deference, and most importantly, trust. That trust became currency Philip valued more than attention or ambition, and it's that trust Philip chose to reward. The transfer of influence didn't come with announcements or drama. It moved quietly, step by step, careful and controlled. Charities Philip championed started reappearing under Edward's patronage. Private land holdings got reviewed, adjusted, sometimes transferred well before Philip died. Royal archivists later noticed that access to sensitive documents had quietly shifted toward Edward, often without a press notice or even an internal memo. For a long time, nobody seemed to notice. Until now. When Edward finally read Philip's last will, he didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't rush to make declarations. He just sat there, silent. People present say he looked genuinely shaken, not by what he'd been given, but by what it demanded of him. The inheritance felt less like a reward and more like a burden suddenly dropped in his lap. By every account, he never asked for any of this, never planned for it. But he understood what it meant. Beneath all the legal language, he heard the message clearly. You were the one I trusted most. Now the burden is yours to carry. It was a gift wrapped in expectation, a reward edged with consequence, because Edward knew silence wouldn't protect him anymore. As the press closed in and speculation caught fire, Edward stayed steady. He didn't confirm anything, didn't deny anything, just kept moving with that same restrained composure that earned his father's final confidence. Only now, every step landed louder than before. For the first time in his life, Edward wasn't a supporting character. He'd become the focal point of a legacy powerful enough to either divide the monarchy or save it from within. But even as Edward quietly accepted what had been placed in his hands, the walls of Windsor were already shaking. A new storm was building. Because someone else had waited a lifetime for this moment and wasn't about to watch it pass in silence. Insiders say Charles didn't sleep for 2 nights after the will got revealed. Behind closed doors, aides claimed the king wept openly, accused his late father of undermining his reign. After decades spent trying to earn Philip's approval, had Charles been outplayed even in death? For a man who waited nearly his entire lifetime to take the throne, the silence after reading those words felt absolutely deafening. Charles, a monarch not easily shaken, reportedly unraveled behind locked doors. Not from the weight of the crown, but from the sting of something deeper, rejection. Not from the public, not from Parliament, but from the one opinion he'd pursued for 70 years. Philip rarely showed affection publicly. Yet Charles, in his quiet, determined way, always believed recognition would eventually come. Instead, what arrived was a final judgment. a will that placed Edward as heir, as confidant, as keeper of the Duke's private legacy. And Charles was left with the same question that haunted him most of his life. Was I never enough for the father I could never quite satisfy? Court insiders say during a private strategy meeting, the king's outburst stunned even his closest aides. He handed the crown to a ghost, Charles reportedly shouted, slamming his fist on the heavy oak table. The room froze. Was this grief, rage, or something more dangerous, an identity crisis unfolding at the very top of the monarchy? His father had always loomed as this figure of discipline and authority. Now, even in death, Philip seemed to reach back and deliver a message that landed like a slap. A verdict, not comfort. It wasn't just that Philip had quietly questioned Charles's leadership for years. It was that he appeared to have built an entire legacy that moved around him. Carefully arranged, deliberately placed, impossible to unsee once revealed. Camilla, sensing the storm building, tried to step in. She reminded Charles of his reign, his legacy, the future they were shaping together. But the words didn't land. In that moment, Charles wasn't a king, he was a wounded son. One witness said the exchange ended with this long, chilling pause, followed by a quiet sentence nobody expected. He never thought I could carry it. Even Camilla had no reply. After that, the palace seemed to turn colder. In the days that followed, Charles's whole demeanor shifted. He became withdrawn, deliberate, careful with every word, as if each phrase carried risk. At a recent council meeting, his usual sharpness was absent, replaced by this distant silence that drew notice even from the most seasoned observers. Royal aides trained to project calm couldn't ignore the change. One reportedly murmured, "It's like he's standing on ice, and he knows it's cracking beneath him." But Charles's unease wasn't only about wounded pride. The implications were real, legal, symbolic, political. The Duchy of Edinburgh, once assumed to pass smoothly under the crown's influence, suddenly felt uncertain. With documents attached, the will seemed to point toward layered private arrangements few outside the inner circle understood. Edward's new position wasn't ceremonial anymore. It carried weight, potentially control. Charles now had to calculate not only what had been taken from him emotionally, but what might soon slip from his grasp practically. What made the wound cut deeper was the sense of exposure, the knowledge that however tightly the palace tried to hold its line, the world was already watching for cracks. Every silence invited a new interpretation. The press speculated without pause. Headlines probed Edward's intentions while commentators whispered about succession optics, about a king who lacked his father's full backing. The idea that Charles had been sidelined in death, just as he'd often felt in life, hardened into a public narrative he could no longer contain. But this wasn't only father and son drama. Buried inside the will were instructions and supporting papers that raised a deeper question, one that threatened the monarchy's foundations. A secondary document, reportedly attached as a codicil and sealed in a separate envelope, contained a startling clause. In it, Prince Philip sketched a vision of what he called a parallel protectorate, to be led by Edward. What was this protectorate meant to do? Whom was it meant to protect? And if its purpose was legitimate, why was it kept hidden? Not just from Charles, but from the Crown Council itself. The codicil wasn't discovered during the first reading of Philip's testament. It surfaced hours later as royal legal advisors worked through a leather-bound case with the Duke's personal crest. Tucked among neatly ordered papers sat a smaller envelope, unlabeled, unlisted, yet unmistakably intentional. When they opened it, the legal team reportedly froze. Inside was a clause invoking a term the monarchy hadn't spoken aloud since the era of King George V, the preservation of the traditional royal spirit. At first it sounded ceremonial, even symbolic. But as the pages got read in low, careful voices, a different reality took shape. His wasn't symbolism. This was structure. Philip had outlined an alternative framework, a parallel arrangement where Prince Edward would serve as steward not of the throne itself, but of its spiritual and historical foundation. The language was precise, the intent layered, the implications impossible to dismiss once understood. Basically, Edward was positioned to oversee the monarchy's soul, The codicil described him as a protector of royal integrity, a role not formally recognized in the modern era, yet framed with striking authority. Charles would wear the crown, but Edward would be entrusted with the legacy and continuity said to hold the institution together. In an astonishing twist, the document also outlined an independent advisory board, reportedly handpicked by Philip. Its members were described as coming from old noble families, historians, even branches of Europe's historic royal bloodlines. This didn't read like ceremonial theater. It read like calculated placement of influence, quiet, insulated, difficult to challenge without triggering deeper questions. What made the discovery even more unsettling were letters tucked into the same folder, handwritten notes, some dated as far back as 15 years. In them, Philip appeared to correspond privately with Edward, laying out a growing fear that the monarchy was drifting from its roots, pulled off course by politics, media pressures, internal conflict. He wrote about protecting not just the throne but the underlying meaning of royalty itself. And at the center of that mission he placed Edward. Not because of ambition, but because Philip believed he embodied steadiness, humility, discretion. The traits he saw as most capable of guarding what others no longer noticed was slipping away. What emerged was honestly chilling. While Charles prepared for kingship, Philip had been laying foundations for an invisible monarchy. Not a rival court exactly, but a parallel system shielded from scrutiny, insulated from scandal, designed to outlast headlines. It would oversee archives, shape ceremonial transitions, hold keys to symbolic estates, including assets that had never sat fully within crown control. Legal scholars later described the idea as a gray zone, not overtly treasonous yet deeply destabilizing, because even if Charles remained king in law and title, Edward under the codicil would be positioned to command something far more elusive and far more potent. Continuity. A crown may rest on one head, but the monarchy's soul, the document implied, had been quietly placed in another's care. And though the codicil's language hid behind ceremonial prose, its implications did not. Inside palace walls, someone else was already preparing to move, ready to use the moment and the silence to act. When Camilla learned of Edward's elevation, palace insiders say the queen consort erupted, slamming down a glass, demanding answers. After everything she endured to stand beside Charles, how could Philip deny them this final endorsement? To the public, Camilla had finally secured her place in the royal hierarchy. A long, winding path marked by scrutiny, sacrifice, scandal, culminating in her role as queen consort. She'd walked through fire to reach the throne beside Charles, earning her position not just through marriage, but through sheer resilience. But with one stroke of Philip's pen, that hard-won ground seemed to shift beneath her. To be absent from the Duke's final recognition felt like more than an oversight. It felt like a deliberate insult, not just to her but to everything Charles had built in defiance of public doubt and family resistance. In Camilla's eyes, this wasn't about property or procedure. It was about legitimacy, about being acknowledged as real, permanent, fully accepted within the inner story of the monarchy. And Philip, precise to the end, appeared to deliver his last judgment without raising his voice, leaving a message that cut deeper because it was written, sealed, impossible to argue with once revealed. Behind closed doors, Camilla confronted Charles with a fury the palace hadn't witnessed since the harshest days of their early union. "He never saw you as king," she snapped, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief. To her, Philip's codicil wasn't merely a gesture favoring Edward. It was a posthumous slight that diminished Charles, stripping him of the unspoken blessing that might have silenced critics for good. Worse, it carved out space for doubt, space for division, space for a quiet migration of loyalty away from the throne and toward the margins. Camilla saw the danger instantly and moved the way she always did, quickly, quietly, with purpose. She began holding closed-door meetings with senior advisors, pressing them to reinforce the king's narrative, shore up wavering confidence, rally Commonwealth allies before rumors hardened into truth. The emerging talk of Edward's so-called protectorate could not be allowed to breathe, she argued. Not if the crown's authority was to remain singular and unquestioned. What started as private cow, Tian shifted into strategy. Titles got reviewed for vulnerability. Appearances were recalibrated for symbolism. Forthcoming engagements were assessed like chess moves. Nothing would be left to chance. Not the optics, not the language, not the loyalties that might otherwise drift. The goal was simple: remind the world that Charles was monarch not only by law, but by lineage, leadership, destiny. There would be no shadow court. Not on her watch. Yet the damage had already begun seeping through the palace walls, where Camilla and Edward once managed cordial ease. Linked by their quieter places within the royal machine, mistrust now replaced familiarity. Glances shortened. Conversations turned formal, measured, carefully bounded. Whatever warmth existed seemed to vanish overnight. Camilla no longer saw Edward merely as a brother-in-law. She saw a rival legacy, one built in silence and sharpened by Philip's final signature. And Edward, for his part, felt the frost settle in. Even public appearances, tightly choreographed to project unity, couldn't fully disguise the change. Smiles held a fraction too long, then dropped too fast. Hands shook, but eyes didn't meet. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The tension showed in the body language. Forced smiles, careful pauses, calculated distance that suggested a crack no polish could hide. The press noticed, the public speculated. And behind Buckingham Palace walls, old loyalties began to tremble under the weight of a father's final will. Yet even Camilla's fury couldn't match the tremors rising in the younger generation, where one prince could see an opening to rewrite his place in royal history. Prince William found himself at a crossroads. Should he stand firmly behind his father's wounded reign or lean toward his uncle's stabilizing presence? With Catherine urging restraint and the world tracking his every move, William faced a silent war of loyalty that could define the monarchy's next chapter. For most of his life, William's been framed as the future, a careful blend of tradition and modernity, positioned to inherit not just the crown but the public's trust. But now the ground beneath that future was shifting. Philip's final will, by elevating Edward with such force, turned the spotlight inward and made the family's internal balance impossible to ignore. It was no longer simply about who comes next. It was about where power gathers, who becomes the institution's moral anchor, which relationships will shape the story the monarchy tells the world. In that new reality, every gesture reads like a choice. Every silence looks like alignment. As Charles wrestled with the emotional fallout and Camilla worked behind the scenes to shore up their reign, William found himself at the center of a fracture he didn't create but could no longer avoid. The question whispered behind palace doors was simple, chilling, inescapable. Where does William stand? The dilemma wasn't black and white. William respected Edward, not just as family but as a man of integrity, someone who served quietly, avoided scandal, kept his loyalty rooted in duty rather than ambition. Yet that very steadiness now complicated everything. If William showed too much deference to Edward, it could be read as disloyalty to Charles. If he froze Edward out completely, it could erode public faith in the family's unity and deepen the sense of internal division. Behind closed doors, the strain between father and son became hard to miss. Charles wanted full-throated support, clear, public, immediate. But William understood that in this new climate, even a small gesture could be interpreted as a declaration. Every silence could sound like a choice. Catherine, often the unspoken force shaping William's choices, became the anchor in the storm. Her message was quiet but piercing. Think of George's inheritance. This wasn't about pride or palace politics. It was about legacy. If the monarchy slipped into open disorder now, it wouldn't be Charles or Edward who lived longest with the consequences. It would be George, Charlotte, Louis, growing up in the aftermath of decisions made in haste, carrying the weight of a fractured institution they never asked to inherit. William had to think beyond the noise, beyond his own hurt, beyond the fear of betrayal. He had to protect the long game. In private, he began seeking counsel, not from courtiers but from constitutional experts, trusted advisors, historians who understood how royal power truly functions when it isn't on display. He wanted to know exactly what Edward's codicil could mean in practice, legally, symbolically, politically. Could it threaten the chain of succession? Could it influence the Privy Council? Could it create the perception of a two-headed monarchy, one crowned, one guardian? The answers weren't simple, but the implications were hard to ignore. Edward now had leverage, and leverage changes relationships. It made him more than an uncle in the background. It made him a variable Palace couldn't fully predict. A wild card, with the potential to steady the institution or destabilize it simply by existing at the center of a new story. Whispers inside Kensington Palace hinted at a quiet contingency plan. A pact, not public, not official, yet powerful in its intent. William and Edward, bound by blood, bound by legacy, now perhaps bound by mutual necessity, were said to be exploring a partnership designed not to defy Charles, but to protect the monarchy from its own unraveling. Nothing formal, nothing written, just carefully timed conversations, understandings left unspoken, trust held in silence while the outside world watched for any sign of fracture. William kept his posture steady, poised, respectful, outwardly neutral. He attended engagements, issued measured statements, appeared beside his father when it mattered most. But beneath that calm surface, he was walking a tightrope so delicate that a single misstep could split everything wide open. In this new atmosphere, even a glance could be interpreted as allegiance. A pause could be treated like betrayal. And in the silence, William wasn't merely balancing loyalties. He was quietly shaping what comes next, trying to hold together a monarchy caught between tradition and transformation, while ensuring the future isn't decided by panic, pride, or one document's shadow. But while the House of Windsor hesitated, others moved fast, and soon centuries-old alliances would be tested in a place many believed had faded into irrelevance. Deep within Scotland's ancient estates, a quiet rebellion began taking shape. Noble families once closely aligned with Philip started holding private gatherings, driven by a single aim: uphold the codicil's vision and back Edward as the rightful steward of Philip's legacy regardless of what Charles declared.
It started as hushed conversations over aged oak tables, beneath tapestries and crests that had watched generations of royal loyalty rise and fall.
In the weeks after the codicil's revelation, something stirred in the Highland aristocracy. Old names, families whose bloodlines ran thicker than politics, deeper than ceremony, began convening. Not for tradition's sake, but for strategy. They didn't gather to mourn Philip. They gathered to interpret him, to revive what they believed he'd set in motion. Plans were discussed in low voices, invitations carried discreetly, messages framed as social calls that meant something else entirely. From corridors older than Windsor itself, the whispers grew louder, more coordinated. What had once been polite deference hardened into intent, and as those meetings multiplied, one unsettling possibility began taking form: that Philip's will had not merely redistributed inheritance, but awakened a network, old, loyal, newly activated, ready to treat Edward's role as more than symbolic. They spoke of a return to what they called the original covenant, a monarchy anchored not only in crown and law but in heritage, symbolism, spiritual duty. To these nobles, Charles's authority felt bureaucratic, administrative, modern, thin. Edward's, however, was framed as ancestral, older than policy, rooted in lineage, therefore harder to challenge. They even invoked a forgotten title: the Royal Guardian of the North. Once treated as ceremonial pageantry, now recast as a mantle of sacred custodianship. In Edward Hay claimed to see not merely Philip's heir, but the spiritual steward of a monarchy they believed had drifted from its moral compass. The codicil became their justification, the will their scripture, the Highlands their battlefield, not with swords or banners, but with silent defiance and legal architecture. Advisors close to the group reportedly began unearthing ancient trusts and royal charters, some traced back to the Act of Union. They argued these instruments allowed noble factions, under extraordinary circumstances, to withhold ceremonial support from a reigning monarch. In their telling, Philip's codicil created exactly such a circumstance. redefining authority not as political control but as spiritual and cultural inheritance, and they pushed the implication to its sharpest edge. If Charles ignored the codicil, he wasn't only disregarding a father's final wishes, he was, they insisted, breaking an unwritten covenant between crown and country. One measured in continuity, tradition, the permission of history itself. Talks intensified behind iron gates and closed doors. Rumblings grew, carefully veiled, meticulously strategic, that if the crown refused to formally recognize Edward's new standing, certain nobles would begin severing ceremonial ties with the London court. That meant withdrawing from royal events, pausing long-standing patronages, potentially rallying regional sentiment behind Edward as the symbolic guardian of royal legacy. It wouldn't be a rebellion of arms. It would be a rebellion of presence, of tradition, of deliberate absence, a cultural fracture disguised as etiquette yet rooted in defiance. The message was simple: legitimacy could be chalet, enged without ever raising a flag. And through it all, Edward remained quiet, respectful, officially detached. He didn't issue statements, didn't posture, didn't push himself forward. But here's the crucial detail: he did not denounce the movement. His silence, whether driven by strategy or inner conflict, carried its own weight. To the nobles it read as tacit approval, permission granted without words. To Charles it could only feel like betrayal, a refusal to shut down a shadow campaign that threatened to weaken the throne by shifting loyalty from the sovereign to the sidelines. And inside palace walls, fear began to spread. This was no longer a disputed inheritance or a private family rupture. It felt like a kingdom splitting at the seams. The monarch's authority might remain intact on paper, but in the Scottish Highlands, loyalty was starting to drift toward the shadow court Philip had, perhaps unintentionally, brought into being. Charles's old nightmares returned, haunted by the echoes of Balmoral, where tradition ran deeper than decree and allegiance could not be purchased, only earned. In the Highlands he sensed a rising storm, quiet, persistent, difficult to confront head-on, a kingdom within a kingdom, and this time it wasn't driven by raw ambition, it was driven by memory, loyalty, legacy, forces that don't respond to modern management or public messaging. Just as the monarchy teetered on the edge of fracture, another shock surfaced. The Queen's personal archivist reportedly produced a sealed document long believed destroyed, a record capable of reopening an even older wound. Among Philip's private effects was said to be a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth II, dated 3 months before her death, addressed to both Charles and Edward. If authentic, it wasn't just a personal note, it was a final intervention, one that could clarify Philip's intent, redefine Edward's role, and expose what the family had tried for years not to name aloud. It held words that delivered both clarity and heartbreak. You were both chosen, but for different things. Bound with the Queen's familiar blue ribbon and signed in her unmistakable hand, the letter was never meant for history books or official record keepers. It was private, piercingly so. A final act of maternal wisdom inside a family ruled by duty, silence, emotion buried for survival. When it surfaced among Philip's personal belongings, its very existence sent ripples through an already fractured palace. It hadn't been catalogued in the official archives, hadn't been referenced in her final months, and yet there it was, dated with care, addressed not to courtiers, not to institutions, but to her sons, Charles and Edward. In a few quiet pages, the Queen appeared to do what no advisor could: name the tension without inflaming it, acknowledge 2 different burdens without declaring a winner. The message didn't read like instruction or propaganda. It read like truth, softly delivered, impossible to ignore. And with that, decades of unspoken strain shifted. Because some words carry a weight no crown was ever designed to hold. She acknowledged what no one else had dared say aloud: that she'd understood Philip's intentions, that she'd accepted them, not out of indifference to Charles's reign, but out of hard-earned understanding. You were both chosen, she wrote, but for NT things. To Charles, she gave the mantle of rule. The burden of kingship, the crown, the ceremony, the public weight that never truly comes off. To Edward, she entrusted something older and quieter, yet no less potent. The family's inner continuity, the guardianship not of government but of legacy. She spoke not as sovereign but as mother, and in that careful balance she let her deepest regrets surface. The letter didn't flinch from the fractures that had shaped their lives. It named the years lost to silence, the decisions made in shadow, the impossible expectations that turned private love into something cautious and withheld. And in doing so it offered no easy comfort, only a truth both sons would have to live with long after the ink had dried. She confessed a fear she rarely allowed to surface, that the institution could one day collapse under its own weight, not from scandal but from forgetting what it was meant to serve. And in her closing lines she offered what neither son had truly received in life, her blessing, not as sovereign but as mother. You must protect each other, remember your shared duty. The crown cannot survive without the heart behind it. The letter was delivered privately to both men. No press release, no official commentary, and most telling of all, no public mention from either Charles or Edward. Yet those closest to them insist something changed that day. The temperature inside their private conversations shifted, as if a door long held shut had finally opened. Whatever had been unspoken for decades didn't vanish, but it moved. Reframed by a final instruction neither could easily dismiss. A softening in Charles's eyes, a stillness in Edward's voice, a fragile pause in the storm. For a moment there was peace, not in power but in understanding. Yet peace, even when offered by a queen, doesn't always hold against the winds of legacy, especially when it arrives too late. As the nation braced for what was meant to be a stabilizing new chapter, one last twist shattered any illusion of closure and exposed a buried truth no one, not even Philip, seemed prepared to face. Just as the dust began to settle, a second will, dated before the official one, was reportedly uncovered by a former royal aide. Its existence alone threatened to ignite chaos. The contents pointed to a radically different plan, a different line of succession, and a detail that raised immediate alarms. A missing signature. But it wasn't the paperwork that chilled the room. It was one clause. Quietly written, brutally precise. That suggested everything the palace thought it understood had been built on shifting ground. And with that discovery the storm returned, louder than before. Because now the question wasn't who inherited what. It was whether the truth had been hidden in plain sight all along. The revelation didn't arrive through a formal release or scheduled disclosure. It surfaced by accident. A former aide rifling through archived files in a remote annex of the royal estate reportedly came across a folder misfiled under an outdated code name. Inside was a document bearing the unmistakable imprint of personal stationery and Philip's familiar slanted handwriting. Yet the tone and structure felt different from anything previously seen. At first it was brushed aside as a rough draft, a preliminary relic of planning, nothing more. The kind of paper that gets written, revised, forgotten. But as the aide read on, small details refused to align with the official record. Dates, wording, intent pointed somewhere else entirely. And then came the twist. This version didn't name Charles, didn't name Edward, it named someone else entirely. An individual whose connection to the throne wasn't direct but ancestral, distant, deeply controversial. The name hasn't been disclosed publicly, but inside the palace it reportedly triggered immediate alarm. The reaction wasn't debate, it was containment. The document was treated like a live wire, handled, logged, quietly buried before it could become a headline. Then came the line that detonated everything. In the middle of the draft sat a clause so explosive it forced royal legal teams into an emergency session. Should these terms be contested, it read, "The Crown must surrender the estate in full." The meaning was stark and frightening. If anyone challenged the validity of this version, the dispute could crack open legal precedent and expose the royal position to real risk. It wouldn't just be a family argument dressed up as tradition. It could become a legal trigger with teeth, forcing the monarchy to relinquish personal holdings tied to that estate, turning a private document into a public reckoning no one could easily control. Balmoral, Sandringham, royal trusts, artifacts, land, even symbolic assets tied to Philip's ancestral holdings in Europe, everything at risk of being swept away. The draft signature line was blank, yet the handwriting throughout had reportedly been examined by 2 royal analysts, both said to have confirmed its authenticity without hesitation. It was Philip's hand, unmistakably. And that left one chilling question. Why wasn't it signed? Was he second-guessing himself? Was he waiting for the right moment? Or had he changed course, then failed to destroy the earlier version, never imagining it would resurface? What began as an inheritance dispute now threatened to become something far bigger, because an unsigned draft paired with language that could force the crown to surrender an estate in full doesn't just spark family tension. It invites legal challenge, public scrutiny, political pressure all at once. In a monarchy built on continuity, even the possibility of competing documents can feel like an earthquake. And suddenly the fight wasn't about who inherited. It was about whether the institution could contain the fallout. If this document ever became public, it could trigger a formal inquiry in Parliament. Legal minds would immediately clash over whether a sovereign's will, especially a private one, could carry binding force over national interests or estates tied to the crown. Some argued it could open the door to judicial review of both wills, with lawyers probing dates, intent, validity. Others warned that staying silent could look like concealment, inviting scrutiny from oversight committees and forcing intervention precisely because nothing was being explained. Suddenly the monarchy wouldn't be managing a rumor cycle. It would be staring down the possibility of a legal reckoning. Inside the palace, speculation turned frantic and sharp. Who knew this second will existed? Who hid it? And for how long? Did Queen Elizabeth ever see it, or deliberately keep it out of the record? And why would Philip draft something so destabilizing in the first place? A moment of uncertainty? A contingency plan? Or a final test aimed at his successors from beyond the grave? Was it an insurance policy? One last chess move? Or had the Duke, famous for brutal pragmatism, simply grown tired of choosing between sons and left behind a fuse he knew someone else would eventually light? The royal family had survived war, endured divorces, abdications, affairs, waves of public ridicule. But it had never been forced to face a scenario this dangerous in its ambiguity, where no one was entirely right, no one was clearly wrong, and the past itself had become a weapon. The second will had been found, and the questions it raised wouldn't fade. They would linger for years, resurfacing whenever the palace tried to restore calm. With every passing day, the ghost of Prince Philip felt less like a memory and more like a strategist, still shaping outcomes from a distance, still forcing choices through silence and uncertainty. The crown could manage scandal, it could outlast controversy, it could even absorb open rebellion. But a battle waged through documents, intention, doubt? That was something else entirely. Because this wasn't only about inheritance or family grievance anymore. It was about legitimacy, about who controls the story, and whether an institution built on continuity can survive when its own paper trail becomes the battlefield. And here's the thing about all of this. The most dangerous opponent is the one who isn't alive to answer. So if you've made it this far, you know this story is far from over. The palace walls are still standing, but the cracks are showing. Loyalties are being tested, legacies are being rewritten, and somewhere in the shadows, Philip's final strategy continues to unfold exactly as he might have intended. If this got you thinking, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because trust me, when it comes to the House of Windsor, there's always another twist waiting just around the corner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.